What if I told you that Joe Biden is not the first president to have ever had his medical condition concealed from the American public? You gotta go back a long ways to find the other example, but here it is. That would be one Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or FDR, who was in deteriorating medical condition in 1945. And of course it ended in his death on April 12th of 1945, or a couple weeks before, about 3 weeks before the war ended, the World War II ended in Europe. The reasons for this concealment are complex and varied, I believe. Obviously, you had a world war going on. You didn't want to tip off the Nazis or Hitler that anything was wrong with the alliance. Of course, this kind of sort of could have potentially backfired in a big way, because had the Germans been in a stronger position at this point in 1945, the alliance could have split, and Hitler actually believed that the alliance would split because of this, because of the loss of FDR. The other reason, though, is a little bit more nefarious than this, and that is FDR did not like his vice president whatsoever. He was very cruel and very heinous, for lack of a better word, towards Harry S. Truman. He never told him about the Manhattan Project. We had nuclear bombs that Truman didn't even know about. And the reason why he picked Truman for his ticket is pretty understandable even in today's context. He wanted the man he could control. He wanted the man who was too stupid, or he thought of as a country bumpkin from Missouri, to ask any questions of him. And so Truman was picked there to not contest his decisions. And so Truman was basically picked to be a cheerleader, and as he called it, a stupid idiot. FDR called him a stupid bumpkin from Missouri. Now we go into Truman's presidency, he was anything but. And his medical condition was concealed also from Truman himself, was concealed from the American public. In a wartime economy, this might have been considered a little bit more prudent, and that's where they were. So yes, so FDR had his medical condition deteriorating, but was concealed. Now the other thing that was always concealed was, it wasn't totally concealed, but it was just never publicized. Of course, about his battle with polio a decade plus before. And so Roosevelt was basically the first celebrity photographer's nightmare, because he was only allowed to be photographed in certain positions and at certain angles, because he wanted to conceal the after effects of the polio. And he wanted to project physical strength in photographs. Luckily for FDR, TV hadn't really been invented yet, and so they couldn't videotape him live or anything like that. And his primary method, of course, of communication was the radio at the time, which he had pioneered back in the 1930s in the Dust Bowl through his famous fireside chats. So he could sit there in his wheelchair and say whatever he wanted to, and nobody would be any of the wiser. So his medical polio condition was not entirely hidden, but it was basically glossed over, and was never projected to show any signs of that particular medical battle that he had in the 1920s. And so here it is, guys. Biden's not the first president to have had his medical condition concealed. FDR, the 25th Amendment didn't even exist at this point. And it was because of the way that this particular series of events went down that the 26th Amendment would later be passed, and also the 25th. So the 25th and the 26th Amendments were passed because of the way FDR's term ended. The 25th, of course, provides for a succession policy in the event of the incapacitation of a president, which is an amendment that is commonly invoked these days whenever a president does appear to be medically not 100%. And it has been invoked. It was invoked after Biden's disastrous debate performance in 2024, and it's also been invoked often for Trump himself. And so that's the 25th. 26th, of course, is the one that limits presidents to 2 terms. But he had that amendment had a very important exception, and that was Truman himself. He would be allowed to run for a 3rd term if he so decided. However, in 1951, he made it very clear that he was not interested in running for a 3rd term, and that closed the chapter on multi-term presidents beyond 2. Truman, of course, had carried so much through his presidency, and he wanted a quiet retirement back in Missouri, which he eventually got, and he lived until 1972. And so Truman himself became very, very accomplished president. He had the Truman Doctrine. He had the Marshall Plan. He had a lot of very, very excellent post-war policies that came about because of his presidency, because he was his own man. He even has his own catchphrase that is in common use today, which is simply "the buck stops here," which was his little nameplate that he had on his desk at all times throughout his presidency. The buck stops here. That was on Harry Truman's Oval Office desk. But he became president with no knowledge of any of Roosevelt's policies or medical condition. Well, policies everybody knew about those, but his medical condition he was not aware of, and so his passing was very sudden to him. And he had only been vice president for 86 days as of April 12th of 1945. Unfortunately, back in 1945, there wasn't really a method upon which you could pretend that Roosevelt was still alive. There was no Weekend at Franklin's movie, for example, at this point. They couldn't do a Weekend at Bernie's type of scenario. It was just it would have been too difficult to hide that he was gone. Or the movie Dave, where Kevin Kline plays the presidential not front man, but presidential fake. But then he gets the office for real and has to pretend that he's still the former president. The techniques for that had not been perfected yet in 1945 either, as far as makeup and costumes and disguises and things like that goes. So unfortunately, without any knowledge of the president's condition leading up to that date, Truman was your typical vice president, basically just a placeholder. The days of aggressively elevating vice presidents to actual political duties didn't start until Jimmy Carter after the 1976 election, and he did that with Walter Mondale. And vice presidents ever since that point have always been very much in tune with the health and well-being of the presidents they serve under. I would actually argue that's probably true today. You'll never hear him say it, but I'm sure J.D. Vance is very well in tune with Trump's true medical condition, whatever that is. Trump is 78 years old after all, so you have to be at least wary of that. And those possibilities, regardless of what Trump's medical reports actually say at this point, which again, of course, are classified secrets. But I'm sure Vance knows what they are. And behind the scenes and quietly outside of public, would act accordingly if it appeared that Trump's physical demise were either imminent or at least somewhat close. But I'm sure Harris even knew with Biden. I have a personal belief that Harris actually was active in the cover-up of Biden, simply because she wanted to be able to swoop in at some point and suddenly claim the presidency, or also to be able to, as she actually did, have the nomination fall in her lap. So that said, Biden is not the first president to have his medical condition concealed from the American public. That was Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1945. And his sudden passing on August 12th of 1945 created a whole series of chaotic events, including Truman having a nuclear weapon that he did not know he had. He didn't find out until the next month about the Manhattan Project and the atom bombs Fat Man and Little Boy, which he then proceeded to drop on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in May of 1945. So in that chaos, unnecessary chaos might I add, you have an equally chaotic ending to both world wars. One other important thing that FDR never told Truman. FDR, at the Yalta meeting, basically sacrificed all of Eastern Europe to Soviet influence. Truman then met after Roosevelt's death with the same leaders in Yalta, not knowing any of this. And of course, Stalin, doing what Stalin does, hid that from him. It wasn't until it was time to basically, as a certain congresswoman said once upon a time, you got to pass the bill to see what's in it. Well, they finally got to the point where it was time to actually act on those treaties and open them up and see what's in them. And lo and behold, FDR had given up all of Eastern Europe to Soviet influence, which resulted in Poland, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, and all those countries falling under Soviet influence. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, same thing. It also provided for the city of Königsberg to also fall under Soviet influence, which also was inside of, bordered by Poland and Latvia and Lithuania. Truman knew none of this and knew none of Roosevelt's medical condition. A lot was concealed from him. And so that is the story of the first president whose medical condition was concealed from the public, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. It's Monday morning, time to get going here and time to get work. Get some coffee, brew some up if you got some. I do. And you folks have a good Monday and good start to the week. As I always say, peace out, homies.